decided to take my dogs for a walk today on one of the trails near my house. I told my husband that I was heading out and wouldn't be gone long. Vansittart Woods Environmental Education Centre was where I ended up. I got there around 11:30 in the morning, and away we went. Absolutely beautiful day. Trails were totally empty, the perfect walk conditions pretty much. I had my 2 female Alaskan Malamutes with me. This is important later too. But we headed down the green trail since it was the shortest and went by some marsh or bogs, and the girls loved to watch the ducks, so it was a nice time. The walk was pretty much uneventful for the first little bit, just the birds chirping, trying to get some birdie loving, the wind in the trees, the usual forest sounds, and then I heard my name. Weird, but it could be someone with a radio on a different trail. Both my dogs were looking in the direction that I heard it coming from. An uneasy feeling starts setting in, but like every rational person, I just chalk it up to an overactive imagination and continue on. But then I hear my name again, a little louder and a little more insistent, if you will. Instead of looking towards where the sounds were coming from, though, I look at my dogs, who are both staring in the direction of my name, and I notice that my older female's hackles were slowly raising. So at that, I thought to myself, yeah, it's time to go. She's not happy. I decided to turn around and go back the way that we came. We only had gone maybe 10 minutes down the trail, I would guess, so it was faster just to turn back anyway. The sign at the trailhead said that it was a 45-minute loop. I hear my name again, though. We walk faster because now the hackles on both my dogs are up. One is 2 years old and her daughter is 8 months old, and hackles up on a puppy is definitely a sign that she's scared. But then I notice that my dogs, they aren't pulling me. They're Alaskan Malamutes. They're bred to pull pretty much. And I mean, anytime we walk literally anywhere on a leash, they're pretty much guaranteed to pull. But now, these 2 dogs are directly beside me. One on the left and one on the right. Kivli now has a low constant growl like she's warning whatever she can't see to back right off. And on our way back, the exact route that we came there was a log in the middle of the trail. I could see my shoe prints in the mud and my dog's paw prints heading the other direction, under this log, which means that this log was definitely not there on our way in. It was big enough and awkward enough that we had to go around it too, not far off the trail, just a few steps. I say, "Come on, Kiv, come on, Echo, let's go," and they follow reluctantly. We hustle back onto the trail, but then I hear Echo's name. She looks. Shortly after I hear Kiv. We're now in a light jog back to the car. The hairs on the back of my neck are now standing up, and everything in my body is screaming to run. Run faster, get out of here. I hear my name again suddenly, but this time it was angry. The closer that we got to the trailhead, the more desperate my name sounds. We're full on running at this point. We got to the parking lot, and I noticed that I can hear the wind and the birds again all of a sudden. I hadn't even realized that I must have stopped hearing the birds and the wind at some point. Well, we piled into the car as fast as we could, and we just didn't look back. I don't know. Am I crazy? Did I upset something? I didn't take anything. I didn't move anything. I didn't even touch anything. Anytime I take my dogs on trails, I'm careful to respect nature and make sure my dogs do too. We even bring our own sticks for them to carry if they want one, so they don't take anything from the parks. I don't know. Was it just some creepy person trying to scare us, or is there something else to it? So this happened to my roommate earlier today. For context, she just recently started working at a clothing store, and it's within like walking distance from our place. We don't live in a terrible area too, but she's very small and pretty adorable, so I do worry about her, especially after listening to so many of the terrifying encounters here. Anyway, her name is Sarah, and at around 5 p.m. today I got a call from her, and she sounded like she was panicking. She kept just saying over and over again, "Please pick me up." I calmed her down and asked her what had happened. and apparently while she was working, two men walked in that immediately gave her the creeps. They were significantly larger than herself and wore all black clothes with hoodies pulled up and literally just textbook bad guy clothes. As Sarah was stocking items in the men's section, these two men approached that same section and start meandering the aisles, but their eyes kept darting around the store as if they were nervous or they were looking for someone. One of them looked directly at Sarah before nudging his buddy and saying something in his ear. Starting to get officially weirded out too, she began walking toward another department to continue her work. As she walked past the men, she heard one of them quietly say to the other, "Did you do it yet?" Unsure of what it was, she did her best to put a good amount of distance between her and them and continued restocking. After a few minutes, she looked up to where they had been in the men's section, and they were no longer there. She looked around, and it looked as if she'd actually left the store, so she felt a little bit relieved by that. That relief, though, was very short-lived. After about 5 minutes, she began to get a really strong feeling that someone was staring at her. She quickly turned around to find that one of the men was standing directly across the aisle from her, holding his phone up in a way that made it very obvious that he was taking photos of her. As soon as they made eye contact, he turned around and sped walked out of the store as though he knew that he'd been caught. Sarah immediately filed a report of the entire encounter to the store security guard, and he did a sweep of the store to see if the other man was still there. He had taken off too, and neither of them could be seen in the parking lot, so the security guard just took note of their appearances, and that was it. But having read about how human traffickers will sometimes take photos of their victims before attempting to abduct them, honestly, it was pretty terrifying. I wish that I could have been there with her all day at work to make sure that whoever these guys didn't come back, but the best that I could do for now is drive Sarah to and from work every day. There's no way that I'm going to let her leave that store alone and risk getting picked up off the street or something. All I can say is that I really hope that those guys, they never come back. In my childhood home, I've had plenty of unnerving things happen that I never really tried to dwell on too much, mainly because it was just a brief glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. Plenty of weird sounds, mostly of a woman either singing or saying someone's name or something. I had 3 older siblings too, who also experienced stuff like this pretty regularly, but we never got too spooked about it. The only instance that still gives me chills to this day is when me and my fiancé moved back into my childhood home to get away from a bad living situation that we were in. It's just me, her, and our dog. Well, we move in and everything seems to be pretty much fine. Nothing too crazy happens, just the usual stuff. Until one night when I was in the kitchen playing with the dog and I took off running to our laundry room area with my dog hot on my heels chasing me. You know, just having some stupid fun. I faced the opening and I just stopped dead in my tracks, along with my dog. The opening to the laundry room was pretty big, had about maybe an 8-foot high opening and probably 8 foot wide as well. I look up in the top right hand corner and I see this thing's head. Now, this is not something that I just caught a glimpse of too. I made eye contact with this thing and it was peeking out of the top right hand corner just looking at me and my dog. The best way that I know how to describe it is sort of how a mannequin looks, the bald ones, but bright white with no nose, big solid black eyes, and a mouth just full of something like shark teeth. When it first emerged, I actually didn't see its teeth, but as I looked at it, its mouth opened and I saw them. That's when my dog just proceeds to take off, and believe me, I was right behind him. This all happened in the span of maybe 10 or 15 seconds. I obviously had to go back there at some point, but when I did, there was nothing there. We've since moved out of that place, but I've lived there for maybe a year after that, and my dog refused to go near the laundry room after that too. I know it's kind of hard to believe this, and trust me, I'd be skeptical too if I didn't see it with my own eyes, but I just wanted to share my experience and maybe see if someone else has had a similar run-in with whatever this thing is, or maybe you guys know what it was. I was 11, almost turning 12, and my family decided to go to America for a holiday where we stayed in Las Vegas for a few days at the Stratosphere Hotel. The hotel is split between hotel rooms and a large casino that we would sometimes had to walk through to get out of the hotel. And one night, my parents had to go and do something, and they told me to just wait there. Pretty stupid of them, I know. But it had been quite a while, and they still hadn't returned. Later on, a black woman, probably in her late 20s, she approached me and asked me if I could accompany her in the elevator because she had a fear of them. My first thought as a naive 11-year-old was, well, of course, as I loved being a helping hand to other people. However, I wanted to tell my parents where I had gone so that they didn't have to worry where I went when they came back. So I told this lady and then went on a quest to find my parents in this Vegas casino alone. Not really sure where they had gone, but wanting to find them fast because I didn't want to keep the lady waiting. I couldn't find my parents anywhere though, so I decided to go back and accompany this lady anyway, since I had nothing better to do and would probably be back before my parents got back. But, to my dismay, when I returned, she had gone. Soon after my parents had finally come back, and after telling them, they explained that she was most likely going to try and kidnap me, but left because I said that I would tell my parents. In retrospect, I find it completely stupid to leave an 11-year-old alone in a Las Vegas casino for like 20 plus minutes. It was a recipe for disaster, and Lord knows what would have happened had that lady still been there. Growing up, I lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment in California. It was me, my 2 younger brothers, my mum, and her boyfriend. My siblings and I, we shared one room, and my mum and her boyfriend, they had the other room. This apartment, as far as I'm concerned, it was haunted. It all started with one night in particular that led to other occurrences over time. The smiling woman is just one example. So, to start, there was this one night when I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. There was no reason for me to be waking up like that, and I was about to lay back down and go back to sleep when suddenly I heard a deep man's voice say, "Run," really fast, followed by silence. Now, it couldn't have been one of my brothers because they're both actually autistic and non-verbal. I looked around the room though, which was pitch dark except for the street lamps outside. I couldn't find the source of the voice. No TVs were on, and it wasn't a neighbor because I literally heard it next to my ear. I turned my TV on after that and didn't get much sleep for the rest of the night. On another occasion, my mum was brushing her hair and she heard a small child laughing in the hallway outside of her bedroom, and then what sounded like a sort of low rhythmic humming sound. She was the only one inside the apartment at the time, so she checked the hall and found video games strewn all over the floor leading into the living room. My mum tried to tell her boyfriend about it, but he was always really skeptical. He was skeptical initially until he himself had quite possibly the most terrifying experience out of pretty much all of us. So, my mum was picking me and my brothers up from school and he was home alone. He was watching football when, out of nowhere, he heard my mum's voice calling for him in their bedroom. He was obviously confused by this because she had not come through the front door at all and he should have seen her come in. Thinking that she had somehow gotten in without him noticing, he went into her room to investigate, and when he got to the edge of the door, he saw a woman standing at the bedroom window with her back turned. Thinking that she had somehow gotten in without him noticing, he went into their room to investigate, and when he got to the edge of the door, he saw a woman standing at the bedroom window with her back turned. She had a long silk red dress on, he said, and when she turned around, she had a really weird and wide grin on her face and tears welled up in her eyes. He said that he screamed at her to get out, thinking that she was some sort of an intruder or something. And then he noticed that she was sort of transparent, like he could see the window through her body, and then just like that, she just disappeared. That night we got home to him walking around the house with Sage, screaming at whoever it was to leave. We didn't know what was going on at first, and it really freaked us out. Other sort of small occurrences have happened too, like lights turning on by themselves, and once I literally felt a cold hand grab me around my neck. It's been about 15 years though, and I've since moved out of state and haven't had a paranormal encounter since leaving that apartment. I've pretty much grown up with paranormal things happening though, so it's something that I do accept. And I have way too many stories to include them all here, but if anyone would care to hear more about anything really, then please comment below and let me know, and I'll see what else I can share. Anyway, thanks for listening. In the summer of 2018, I was in a long-distance relationship. Not that long, he had only lived about 4 hours away. That was pretty serious, but also pretty new at the time. My boyfriend, who had driven those 4 hours to see me on every break that we had from school, essentially begged me to come and visit him in his grandmother's house. I didn't have a car at the time, but I really wanted to impress him and show my dedication to the relationship by going to visit him. So I dropped some coin on a Greyhound bus, and I was excited to meet up with him. At first, everything seemed fine. I took a seat at the back of the bus because I really didn't want to speak to anyone, but the bus was pretty full, so inevitably this guy sat down next to me. No red flags, just seemed like a regular guy in maybe his late 20s or early 30s, so I put my earbuds in and I just ignored him. Before I continue, I would like to highlight some character flaws of mine at the time that this happened though, when I was 18. So, I was an extremely non-judgmental person and tended to see the best in people, even to a fault. This tends to land me in some very bad and sometimes dangerous situations. At 18, I simply didn't know any better and kind of overlooked potentially concerning actions. So there was a guy in the seat in front of us who would not stop talking to no one in particular, but he was facing a girl in the next set of seats across from mine. Again, I didn't really want to judge. I mean, maybe he had some type of mental problem that he couldn't help, and he wasn't doing any harm. So I just ignored him too and continued to stare out the window, listening to music. That is, until he turned around and just stared at me. Now, I might have been naive, but I'm not stupid. A chill ran through my spine as I made eye contact with this man. He had these cold, callous eyes, and his skin lacked so much saturation that it looked like he'd been covered in dust. I take out my earbuds, and he immediately turns to the guy next to me, and they engage in conversation. I was also really set on edge when I overheard them discussing how they were both ex-convicts that recently got out of prison. Now, remember me being non-judgmental? Well, I figured that maybe they served prison time for something that was minor, given their access to a public bus. I'm really not sure how all of that works, obviously. They don't do background checks for a Greyhound bus, but still, I tried not to think anything of it. The man in front of us turns to me now, and I can't remember exactly what he said, but he called me baby, which kind of freaked me out a bit, but I couldn't say that I wasn't used to it. I figured that it was just another grown creep hitting on me. So annoyed, I put my earbuds back in and ignored him until the bus stopped at my rest stop. Most people got off, including the guy next to me, leaving just me and the guy in front of me in the back of the bus. He asked if I could come up and sit next to him to make friendly conversation, and my dumbass actually did it. Keep in mind that I was 18 and unfathomably stupid, and I also lacked the gut feeling that something was wrong. But he starts telling me that he just got out of prison and hasn't seen a woman in a long time. I said something along the lines of, "Well, that's unfortunate," and inched away from him. He scooted over to me so that our legs were touching, and I think that's when my heart rate really started to pick up. The next thing I know as well, his hands are on me. He's wrapped them around my waist and went on about how small I was, and then commented about how it had been so long since he last touched a woman. Well, I was completely paralyzed. I had no idea what to do. He kept going on about how I should be a model while continuing to grope me. Again, I was absolutely terrified and couldn't bring myself to move. Soon enough as well, everybody got back on the bus, including the guy who sat next to me, who shot the other man a weird look that prompted him to let me go. I scrambled out of the seat and still sat behind him, not knowing what to do, but feeling safer that other people were on the bus now. He didn't bother me again after that, so I just prayed that it would stay that way. But it gets worse. So the bus stops at another rest stop, and this time I get off, not wanting to be stuck in that vehicle again. I'm just chilling, as much as one can be chill after something like that, when a girl that I recognized from the bus came up to me, and she said, "Hey, that guy that was just talking to you just left in a car, but I thought I should let you know that he's circling the building. He keeps leaving and then coming back. I'm sorry that I didn't say anything earlier." I thanked her for the warning, and I put on a hoodie in 85-degree weather and flipped up the hood so that he couldn't see me get back on the bus. And luckily after that, I never saw him again. I was too embarrassed to tell anyone what had happened, due to my lack of competence and general understanding of how the world can be. And when I met up with my boyfriend, I gave him the very vague details, wanting to forget it ever happened. But now I don't think that that's possible. I didn't believe in ghosts for the first 22 years of my life. Always thought that there was some reasonable explanation to hauntings, and honestly, I still kind of do. Maybe it's not a ghost, maybe some kind of weird gravitational energy messing with things. I'm not sure, but anyway, here's my story. So my roommates and I, Dee, moved out to Colorado with meager savings into a small cabin that was pretty out in the boonies. Our closest neighbors used their cabins as summer homes, so we didn't really have anyone nearby. That's what's cool about living in the mountains, though. There's a sense of, total isolation that you won't get anywhere else. You can turn off everything in your living space and hear nothing except the breeze, and no highways or car alarms, just nothing. It's very peaceful, to be honest. But after the first week or two in this cabin, Dee and I both began noticing some weird things happening. First was this eerie feeling that we got. I remember Dee once joking with me that he didn't like being in the cabin alone because it gives him creepy vibes. There was one back room in particular where, if you stood in it at night, that you would feel like you were being watched. Sometimes I would come home from work and just have this sense of total dread and unease. At the time, I just wrote it off as me being paranoid. You know, hallucinating stuff that isn't there because I wasn't used to the total silence and the winter isolation. But then I started noticing stuff getting moved around as well. One morning, my car keys would be missing and I'd frantically be searching, only to find them in a really weird spot, like on top of our refrigerator or something like that. I honestly thought that it was Dee messing with me, but he kept insisting that it wasn't. Soon, he started having his stuff get moved too, and he would get really pissed off at me, thinking that I was trying to prank him back. And then one night, we were sitting around playing video games when something just flew across our field of vision. We both looked at each other for a second before realizing we both saw it. For context too, the cabin was a typical A-frame, so for the most part it was one big room separated into a loft and a downstairs, with the kitchen and our beds at one end and the living room TV wood stove at the other end. So whatever small object flew across the room had gone from the kitchen all the way to the front door. We examined it closer and found out that it was a single green bean from our meal that evening. We just kind of held it up and looked at it for a second. It had flown all the way across the house from the stovetop in the back of the way to our front door. We didn't really have anything to say about it too because, well, it was just super weird. But the next morning was when I knew that our house was haunted. So I was watching TV in the front room, and suddenly there was a huge loud crack, and the roll of paper towels that we had sitting in our kitchen counter just flies across the room, knocking things off the table and spilling water everywhere. And the roll had been thrown with huge force. Like, let me clarify this too, to the point where I thought Dee had tried to chuck it at me. So I angrily turned around to tell him off. But when I did, I realized that Dee was in the shower the whole time, getting ready for work. I felt a chill go down my spine. Some force or spirit or ghost or whatever you want to call it had thrown this across the room. Dee didn't believe me when I told him, and I don't blame him really. But he soon came to his senses as well. So the next couple of months spent there was just absolute craziness. Everything from car keys to full decks of cards to box cutters would be thrown around our apartment right in front of our eyes. We'd hear weird growling sounds at night that sounded like they were right in the middle of our house. To be fair though, sound carries weird in the mountains, so we maybe just heard some nearby animals on this one. But one time my roommate stormed out of the shower furiously and says, "What the hell, man? Why would you turn the lights out of the shower like that?" I told him that I had no idea what he was talking about, but by far the most frustrating thing was definitely how our stuff just kept going missing. I mean, it got ridiculous. One night we left our cars in a very particular spot, just to see if they'd moved in the morning. And when we woke up, sure enough, they were gone. But not just that. They'd been tucked between the pages of To Kill a Mockingbird on our little bookshelf. It took us hours to find them as well. Another morning, I couldn't for the life of me find my phone, so we tried calling it and it would ring, sounding loudly throughout the house, but we just couldn't pinpoint the exact spot. Finally, though, we tracked the ringing to the bathroom, but it sounded like it was coming from behind the damn wall. The vanity sort of hung there, so I figured, screw it. It's probably in the wall, seeing how weird everything is anyway. Maybe there's a hole or something. So I took the vanity off its hanging nail, and as soon as I moved it, my phone slid out of the back and clattered on the floor. At that point, Dee and I looked at each other, and his face was totally pale. Like, how the hell could that even happen? How was that possible? But the haunting just got to the point of, being silly. We had a friend come visit, and as soon as he opened the door, my car keys were thrown at her face from across the room. She was like, "Wait, is this cabin haunted?" We kind of joked, like, yeah, things get thrown around sometimes, you just have to ignore it. But after that, she didn't want to stay there anymore, and that was the point when I asked my landlady if she could provide some history on the cabin that we were renting. She got super defensive about it as well, and claimed that she owned it for years and never had anything weird happen. But long story short, we eventually got evicted a couple of months later. I won't go into why, because there was really no good reason for it, and it's not the point of this story. But yeah, the uneasiness persisted till we moved out. Although, in the last month of living there, the ghost, or whatever you want to call it, chilled out on throwing objects at us, and I still don't have a concrete explanation for the weird stuff that happened, but after that, I definitely was more open-minded about ghosts and spirits and other stuff like that we just don't understand. Some of this information I got from my mum, as I was too young to remember all of it. But from the moment that I started speaking, I would tell my parents about Dodd. I was obsessed with him, and I would tell everyone about him. I would talk to him, I'd play with him. My parents assumed that it was just an imaginary friend. I mean, lots of kids have them, and considering I'm the youngest of 4 boys, they guessed that my brothers just didn't want to hang out with a little kid, so I made my own friends. It began to escalate, though, when my mum would find me, 2 or 3 years old, sitting alone in my room having conversations to thin air and responding as if someone had said something, nodding, listening, laughing as if he told a joke. I treated Dodd like he was a real person, and I really genuinely believed that he was. Part of me still does, in fact, I have to admit. I would demand that Dodd have his own seat and his own plate of food every single day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Anytime that we left the house, I'd scream and cry if they forgot Dodd in the house. He had to have his own seat. He ended up having an entire toddler's car seat because I was so scared of him getting hurt. And he had to be picked up, set in his seat, and had to be buckled in just like they did to me. My parents had to talk to Dodd the way that they talked to me, or I would get upset that they were ignoring him as well. I still have memories of Dodd as well, genuinely seeing Dodd with my own eyes. I'd swear on my life that he was really there to this day. He was about a foot or so tall, the size of a small child, like I was, but he was pure white, mostly featureless as well, bipedal. He had no face. He had an outward bump where a muzzle should have been, and two indents where he should have had eyes. He didn't wear clothes and didn't have real paws or hands. He almost looked like maybe a gummy bear with round-tapered hands, and feet as well, with no details whatsoever. But I remember that he was solid white and not transparent. He didn't speak verbally. It was more like I just knew what he was saying. I also don't really remember him walking anywhere or moving at all, really, but I'd look away and look back, and he'd always be in a different place. I'd swear on my life as well, on everything that I know, in fact, that he in some sense was real. Now, I don't know how old I was exactly. I would have to guess around 4 or 5. But I went outside with Dodd one day because he wanted to show me something. He led me around the back of the house to a square panel of sorts that I'd never seen before. It was like a tiny door held with a simple hook latch. I opened it, and inside was a concrete floor, a really low ceiling, and a dusty old red tricycle. The classic little one that you probably imagine, and it was full of cobwebs, and I couldn't see anything other than a tiny bit of concrete and the tricycle because the sun was adjacent from where I was. But I climbed in the little cubbyhole and just sort of sat there with my knees to my chest, and I can still vividly remember seeing Dodd standing just outside the door, facing me. I didn't even know this spot existed. I had no reason to. I mean, who tells their toddler about a spooky concrete hole in the back of the house that's only accessed from the outside? Recently, I told my parents about that memory a few months ago, and they said that they purposely didn't tell me or my brothers about it, because if you go inside that area, about 2 feet in, the concrete just drops off down into open pipes, wires, and insulation, and since there's no access from the inside, it'd be really hard to find us if one of us fell in. I also didn't forget about Dodd for a single day for like 6 years. I never let one of his meals go by. I never ignored him for a whole day. I never let us go on a car ride without him for 6 years, but eventually we had to move houses. I'd lived in the same house this whole time, and it was the final day that we'd ever be at that house, and we were getting in the car to go to the new house. My mum picked me up and put me in the car, and then turned to pick up Dodd and bring him too. When she did, I immediately started crying and angrily said, "Dodd's not coming." And after that, I apparently stopped talking about Dodd altogether that day. And for years, I would get extremely upset and angry if someone mentioned him around me. My mum told me that she researched the house that we had lived in, and there was in fact a little boy years before us that had died when a gas pipe, maybe I think, bursted directly in his face. And as scary and weirdly fitting for my faceless friend as that sounds, I don't know if I buy into it personally. I was never afraid of Dodd, and I don't think of him as scary now. I think it's extremely strange, obviously, especially considering that he appeared as a featureless bear and he stuck with me for 6 years, much longer than most imaginary friends. I do think it's mind-boggling, though, that he brought me to a place in the house that I'd never been in, and that the knowledge of it was deliberately kept from me. And I mean, sure, it could absolutely be some sort of absurd psychological thing, or it could be some strange kind of ghost or spirit, but Either way, I believe in and still think kindly of Dodd. No matter what he actually is, I'm just grateful to have had a strange childhood friend like Dodd.